Hello and welcome to another In the Chemicals Conversation podcast series by Argus Media. I am Alan Williamson, lead consultant for Olefins for Europe, and I'm joined today by Victoria Hatherick, editor of European Emissions, and Anna Fittock, chemicals analyst. Thank you both for being here for this podcast on the impact of the EU's emissions trading system, or ETS as it's known, on the EU petrochemicals industry. So, to start us off, Victoria, could you tell us what the EU ETS is and what the rules are for the European chemicals industry?
Yes, absolutely. So the EU ETS has covered the production of bulk organic chemicals as well as some specific acids since 2013. And what it is a market mechanism which is essentially designed to drive decarbonisation in the sectors that it covers. So it functions as a cap and trade system, which means that the EU sets a supply cap, which then is converted into tradable carbon allowances. These allowances are auctioned by the EU and then they can be traded between market participants as necessary, and eventually companies covered by the system hand in the number of allowances equivalent to their emissions for a given year back to the EU. The cap falls over time to drive lower emissions in those sectors over time. And historically, industry has received a proportion of those allowances free. This is designed to guard against carbon leakage, but I'm sure we'll come back to this later, but the carbon border adjustment mechanism will see some of those free allocations phased out by 2034.
Okay, so I believe this is the first time that the EU environmental legislation has added additional costs for CO2 to the European olefins industry. Have we therefore done any analysis about the cost implications for the European industry on this?
Yes, Alan, we've modelled this from a typical EU cracker perspective, and also from the perspective of the most carbon efficient crackers that make up that top 10% benchmark group.
Great. Are you able to tell us a little more about this, Anna?
Yeah, of course. So to assess the cost, we needed to first understand what the expected carbon emissions are. So these are calculated based on a given steam cracker's total production of high-value chemicals, or what we'll refer to as HVCs, such as ethylene, propylene, C4s, etc., multiplied by its carbon emission intensity. So for our analysis, we assumed 840,000 tonnes of HVCs produced at an average naphtha cracker site, and that 0.891 tonnes of CO2 would be emitted for each product tonne, yielding total carbon emissions of around 750,000 tonnes. To calculate how much of this is to be paid for, we need to understand the volume of emissions in excess of the free allocation. So free allocations are calculated by multiplying the capacity to produce HVCs on site, which we've already assumed to be 840,000 tonnes, by the benchmark emission intensity, which is assessed by the EU to be 0.61 tonnes of CO2 emissions per tonne of high-value chemicals, and that's for the 2021 to 2025 period. So this would give the site in question just over 572,000 tonnes of carbon allocations, leaving 176,400 tonnes of CO2 emission allowances that need to be purchased from the EU carbon market. How much this will cost depends on the EU ETS price at the time of purchase, but if the annual average 2025 price is used for reference, this is going to cost at least 60 euros for each tonne of high-value chemical produced for a standard naphtha cracker.
Interesting. So, Victoria, how has the EU ETS price evolved since the market fully launched in 2008? And where do we see it potentially going?
Yeah, prices have varied quite a lot actually under the ETS since its launch, partly because of the timing of the launch itself. So that kind of coincided with the financial crash, and that meant that economic activity in the region slowed down a lot. We had a lot less industrial production. And over the next few years, we also started to see a lot more renewables coming online, which reduced the carbon intensity of the power generation mix as well. And so we had quite a big oversupply of allowances building up over time. So by 2013, we were seeing prices below €3 per tonne, so very, very low. Then the EU brought in something called a market stability reserve to the system, which absorbs excess supply from the market every year. And that really helped to support prices a lot. And in combination with quite a few other factors, that ended up leading to prices pulling above €100 per tonne in 2023. So a huge difference from a decade earlier. They've come back down a little bit, as Anna alluded to. We're now looking at prices at around €70 to €80 per tonne. But given that we are going to see the supply cap continue to fall over the coming years, and it's actually falling at a steeper rate than it was in the past, all while we're having free allocations phased out for industry, which will see more demand for allowances in the market from industry. Maritime emissions are being phased into the system as well. We could potentially see other sectors coming in, such as the waste sector, in the coming years. Essentially, what we're expecting is supply to fall quite a lot and demand to increase at the same time. So that's likely to squeeze the system and support prices further in the coming years.
Okay. So given our understanding that would further increase demand as free allocations reduce and lower supply as the EU continues to reduce the total number of allowances released into the system, we will see a continued upward trend in allowance prices, all of which of course is designed to encourage EU producers to invest in options to mitigate and reduce their CO2 emissions. It does all seem a bit unfair, given overseas producers currently don't see any of these additional costs, which has to be a serious disadvantage for the European industry. What therefore is the EU proposed to do about this, levelling the playing field here? And isn't this where CBAM, which you mentioned earlier, intended to help? So how is CBAM going to support the European olefins competitiveness, Victoria?
Yes, so CBAM is indeed intended to level the playing field between costs faced by EU producers under the ETS and those outside the EU that don't have those costs. This is essentially the function that free allowances are supposed to play at the moment, and that's why we're seeing those free allocations phased out as CBAM is phased in. CBAM will place an effective carbon price on goods imported to the EU. So that's how that's supposed to make things fairer in theory. I think the hope is that it's perhaps a more efficient way of doing that than free allocations, because one of the issues with free allocations is that you're simply not paying the carbon cost at all. So that does take away some of the incentive to decarbonize. Whereas with CBAM, you still have that carbon price signal, but other companies outside the EU are in theory paying the same price as you. So that's probably one of the reasons for changing the approach on that. Of course, that only works if CBAM prices are aligned with EU ETS prices. So the idea is that CBAM certificates will be priced based on an average of the EU ETS auction price. In 2026, that will be a quarterly average, but by 2027, it will switch to a weekly average. So in theory, they should be quite closely aligned price-wise.
Okay, that all sounds logical. But Anna, why are European producers therefore so concerned about ETS and CBAM?
So in its current form, CBAM only applies to olefins and their polymers, as further down the derivatives chain, the complexity and diversity of products means that the administration costs increasingly become a barrier to implementation. This means that European producers could face increasing imports of cheaper olefin-derived finished or partially finished goods, eroding the domestic demand for olefins. This consequence is often referred to as carbon leakage. Also, CBAM only applies to direct emissions on imports and ignores, for example, CO2 emissions on energy production, which is covered by the EU ETS scheme. This means EU producers will still face higher energy costs from ETS CO2 on their energy prices versus the overseas producers, which is another factor often quoted by EU producers. Although I do believe the EU is proposing to try and address this higher energy cost burden for producers from 2026, and we're waiting to hear more details on this. It's important to note that all of this additional cost will be inflationary for the end consumer. Clearly, this is something consumers will not be pleased about, and this could potentially result in the unintended consequence of the relocation of manufacturing industry away from Europe to keep prices attractive to consumers.
I see. And of course, ultimately, this is why increasing energy and CO2 costs are often mentioned as factors in decisions to rationalise plants currently, given the outlook for global margins for olefins for the next 5 years is very low, even without these additional costs. So, Anna, I believe you've summarised all this in a white paper that is available for people to review. And so, where can people access it?
Yes, this paper is freely available on the Argus Media website and is also linked to the description of this episode.
That's great, Anna. And I believe we are also looking at potentially incorporating these costs into our EU cracker margin models and cost curves in the future.
That's correct, Alan. Once we're confident in our modelling, we look to add these to the generic European cracker margin and cost curves so that their impact can be better understood on a regular basis.
That sounds great, Anna. And perhaps also a good point to wrap up today's podcast. I hope everyone listening has found this useful, and I would also like to remind them to take a look at the associated white paper that was mentioned. And so I would really like to thank Victoria and Anna for joining me today and for providing their insights on this important subject.
Thanks, Alan.
Thanks very much.
This then concludes today's podcast. We hope you found it interesting, and any subsequent questions or comments are always welcome. Meanwhile, we look forward to welcoming you to the other podcasts in this series, where members of our regional olefins consulting team will give a market update from across the regions in separate podcasts. Also, David Appleton, our senior LPG consultant, will discuss the developing relationship between LPG and petchems and the future outlook for this important feedstock, together with Sarah Ray, the Vice President for Olefins and Derivatives. Finally, if you want to learn more about our market coverage, including carbon pricing or the global ethylene trade balances, which are covered in our biannual analytics product at country and regional level, together with a 10-year price forecast, please get in touch via our website. So thank you for listening.